Welcome back to the Monkey Mind Lab. On today's episode, we have with us Professor Amit Prakash, a visiting assistant professor of international and global studies at Middlebury College. Professor Prakash also serves as the director of the Rohatyn Global Fellows Program. A historian by training, his research delves into the intersections of imperialism, anti-colonialism, and migration. He is the author of Empire on the Seine, The Policing of North Africans in Paris, 1925 to 1975, which examines the policing and state control of North African colonial immigrants in Paris during the period of decolonization. At Middlebury, Professor Prakash teaches courses on policing, borders and identification, and anti-colonialism. His teaching encourages students to critically examine how state power and identification practices shape societies. Beyond academia, he also co-hosts the history and current events podcast, No Politics at the Dinner Table, and has been featured in the documentary The Price of Safety. Please join me in welcoming Professor Amit Prakash.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's begin with the three questions that I ask my guests. What do you teach? Why do you teach it? And how did you get into it?
Okay. So I teach courses broadly conceived around, let's call it, critical security analysis, but from a historical perspective. So I'm trained as a historian. My specialized work is on France and its empire, and particularly around questions of surveillance, migration, and security, and the discourses around it. And I think, for the reason why, I guess one major reason that sort of transformed me is 9/11. So 9/11, obviously 2001 and 2002, I started graduate school. And what I started to understand by following politics and also noticing the type of courses that were being offered where I went, which was Columbia University, were very much centered around this new age of security. And I think the post 9/11 era becomes kind of intelligible as such when we think about security as the dominant theme, which I see as mostly as ill, but one could say for good or ill. How I got into this, the reason I went to graduate school was basically teaching. I taught high school for a number of years before I went to graduate school, and I thought, who am I to be teaching this stuff? I need to know more. And so I needed more historical training, and teaching is still one of my favorite things to do about the job. So,
All right, so shall we delve into today's big question?
sure, let's do it.
So here's the question. If you decolonize the mind, what happens to the culture it carries?
It's a very big question, right?
Yes.
So let's break it up. Decolonizing the mind, right? So this is the title of a book by a literary scholar named Thiongo, who recently retired from NYU. And he basically made this argument about what decolonizing the mind requires, which basically means purging post-colonial societies of the linguistic traces of the colonial masters, because the argument goes is that our thoughts are made precise and possible by the linguistic structures in our minds. So what is sayable is basically the limits of what is thinkable.
Okay.
And so the argument being that, well, in African societies, because French and English had been imposed by the sword and other linguistic traditions purposely crushed, or at least sidelined, the reanimation of those traditions would allow for a full flourishing of, in this case, African cultures, in distinction to what the colonial establishment tried to replace it with, right? So that's one approach, which is, okay, let's get rid of the old language. And we've seen this pop up in various ways, Madras becomes Chennai and so on in India. So there's these sort of elements and strategies to try to sort of get rid of I guess, the symbolic power of the past masters. I'm of two minds about how effective that is, because sometimes it can be all style and no substance, if you like.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So that, sure, you can change the name and so on, but let's take the case of India. You change the names of some of the major cities and so on. Fine, it's your country. You can name what you want. But if you retain about 80% of British colonial law and retain that system, how much actually, it seems like a cosmetic change more so than a substantive one. So there's limits to that approach. I understand where that's coming from, but there's limits to that even if you went full, whole hog on it. The other element is, and this is the one I'm sort of more, affiliated with or endorse, which is understanding that colonialism at its base is a set of relationships. It's producing a set of relationships that are hierarchical in order, and in different colonies around the world, there were different rationales for that hierarchy. But fundamentally, colonialism is in between things, it's not the thing itself. It's how we organize things. And so if you get at that, decolonizing the mind, well, that means, first of all, doing an analysis of what colonialism actually was.
Mhm.
And I don't think we fully understood that yet.
No, it's percolated into nooks and crevices which people wouldn't even have thought that it's influenced by colonialism, but it's very much there.
Yeah. Just the basic way we see the world and so on is very much sort of dominated by a colonial perspective whose ramifications I think we still need to study. So before you can get to decolonization, I think you need to fully understand the import of colonization. So we might be jumping the gun, if you like, to say that, oh, let's decolonize this, let's decolonize that. It might be, I understand the impulse, right? And I'm ethically sympathetic to it, but it might end up being misguided or sort of short-termist in terms of what you're actually doing, because a quick victory of a name change or something like that, while it does have symbol, it's not nothing.
Yes,
So what I would just say is this, very simply, that symbolism matters. It's something, but it's not everything.
of course. Yeah. So speaking of decolonizing, is it, and we've kind of answered this, but is it really about just removing statues, tearing down paintings, burning books, rewriting history? Or is it something deeper, like changing the way we think, speak, and see ourselves? There has been a push, even in India, to change the name to Bharat, but also speak more Indian languages, less of English. But before we can go all of to that, yes, we know some of it is performative, some of it does make a difference on a scale of like pride or something. But let's start with a real question. Keeping in mind that India, for example, is a country that's been through two series of empires. You've had the Mughal Empire, you have the British Empire. There have been other countries which have been ruled by the French, the Dutch. It's all over the world. Who owns culture? Are museums, language policies, education systems still very, very colonial? And it goes beyond that, like on a socio-cultural level, the way people interact, the certain customs that people have. We looked at Hindu traditions a while back and looking at how that's been influenced by colonialism. I think the real question is, culture as we know it today, is it still owned by our colonial rulers and overlords, or is it something that we've kind of made into our own thing today?
Okay. So you have a couple questions in there. I'll start with the first one in terms of, is it a matter of destroying the sort of cultural treatise left over and so on? I'll just say no matter what book, I'm not in favor of ever burning a book, whatever the book is. Again, I think that's just sort of a misguided attempt at erasure and is fundamentally unthinking, right? So I'll start with that premise. In terms of cultural transformation and sort of starting out by uprooting something, really root and branch uprooting and then starting anew, I think that is historically diluted, was how I would put it. Colonialism happened and it created some irrevocable changes. Colonialism, on the one hand, is probably the most powerful form of globalization that we've seen. It brought the world together, it knitted the world together, but it knitted the world together just so, in a hierarchical way, with asymmetric power and wealth being located in former metropoles. And so that history can't just be forgotten about. And there are some important changes to the cultures that have been integrated, quite frankly, into those cultures and that are now part of those cultures. I think the the idea that, okay, let's just for the sake of argument talk about English, right? If say Nigeria or India and so on wanted to say, we're going to get rid of English from all aspects of Indian or Nigerian culture, well, what then you have are going to be gatekeepers who are going to decide, well, this is what Nigerian culture is, and then this is what Indian culture is. So the idea of an authentic culture, either to return to or to produce for the future, is fundamentally based on those who have the power to define it.
Yeah.
So really the question of who owns culture is really a question of who has the power. And so if you have the power, you have the power to say this is this, that is that. This is Indian, this is coming from Timor or something like that, and therefore it's coming from outside and not so, even though the cultural, political, and social contributions of the Mughal descendants are inescapable in India.
Yes.
I teach a course that has the title of Who Owns Culture, and it's about culture and decolonization, but the title's kind of facetious because there's a lot of things sort of assumed in that question, which is, first of all, that culture is something to be owned. It's predicated on this idea of a sort of possessive liberal subject that commodifies everything and owns things. Culture is constantly in flux. It's constantly being produced, and which makes it both very democratic and egalitarian, but it's also within a matrix of power. And therefore, those who have the most power in the society have hegemony, right? So, and they get to decide this is authentically India, right? And I always sort of think about this stuff with food, for instance. How do you make authentic Indian dishes, especially after Columbus, right? So that with the Columbian exchange, you get potatoes and things like that that make their way to India that utterly transformed the cuisine there. And there's a lot of dishes with potato in India that are seen as, fundamentally authentic, but they were only possible, 15th, 16th century onwards, right? But India has been around for much longer. So who decides then which is the authentic, right?
It's not been authentic to the continent because it didn't grow there, but it's now a fundamental part of people will eat the aloo with dosas. People will have aloo parathas. Aloo paratha is the biggest thing of like, oh, Indian culture.
Right.
Is it Indian?
Yeah. And so one could say the same thing for like the kind of Hindi English vernacular that's developed in India, right? So that a lot of people speak this way. There's sort of this mishmash of, let's call them indigenous Indian languages, but with smatterings of English and stuff like that. I don't think it's necessarily an indication of their minds being colonized, but they've appropriated that language, intermixed it, and made something new. And sometimes this is called in the literature indigenization, right? Where you sort of assimilate what were once, let's call them foreign elements, but then you've sort of tamed them, if you like, naturalized them and made them your own. So, in terms of, the culture, as your sort of first question was asking about, what is lost or what is kept in the sort of the culture, the only way to actually purge a culture of elements that you decide are foreign is through force. And force does not necessarily produce belief. It produces compliance, but it doesn't necessarily mean you've actually decolonized the mind in the way you want to, right? You may have the mimicry of this, but you don't actually know what people are actually thinking because they might well be afraid.
And we see a lot of that in the world today.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of nationalist movements around the world. I mean, it's interesting. They're all post-colonial in their own ways, so Hungary and Poland are good examples. They're coming from the post-Soviet empire. We have it in India. We have it in America now. So, yeah. And we have to remember that America was also a colony
of the British,
And that's sometimes forgotten. There's a quotation from a thinker, Etienne Balibar, that I like a lot, which basically says, and he's talking about borders in this case, and he basically makes the argument is that every country in the world, as we know it, was either colonized or was colonizing and sometimes both at the same time, right? So that's what the modern world is. That's the sort of cauldron in which it was forged. To get beyond it, to decolonize it, again, I still think we need to have a fuller reckoning with what we were given before we can decide what we want to do and we want to move on.
So we still have a lot to unpack about colonialism. I think we really need to sit down and look at the extent to which it influences our lives today, even though people, oh yeah, the British are gone or the French are gone. They may not be there physically, but their ideals are still very much influencing society, and laws being made today, especially in India, looking at the legalization of the LGBTQ community. It took 75 years,
Right.
and it's still not legal to get married. Same-sex couples are not acknowledged. The West has moved on. Why are we still sticking to the Victorian norms of it?
Right. Right. And so there's different things to think about. There might be some elements that are contributions from, let's say, French and British cultures that you want,
Yeah.
right? There might well be things that you want to retain. And that's why this sort of either-orism, and it's sort of, I think it's predicated on this idea that these cultures are hermetically sealed and then they clashed and one was just sort of juxtaposed on the other, or superimposed, I should say. Not really the case, right? That's not how culture works. You know, anthropologists have been demonstrating this for decades now, that culture is something that's alive, is not static. And that's precisely what makes it so valuable. And it's also precisely what makes it so political. You can see that every movement, these nationalist movements, they all start as cultural movements, and they identify an element in their given culture that they think is objectionable, and then they organize politics around it. So, you know, which is a long way of saying politics is downstream from culture.
Yep. There's this one joke which a comedian made, which basically said, in India, you have to plan a political campaign around suppressing a minority to get elected.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, which one are you going to pick?
Right. And which, again, is an old tactic, right? That's an old legislative or electoral politics tactic that I think in modern politics was really perfected around the turn of the century, around 1900, the last century, I should say, in Vienna, right, around anti-Semitism, right? So that it's Viennese mayoral politics were utterly transformed by the political innovation of mobilizing anti-Semitism to whip up votes. And now you can just sort of identify a minority, identify a vulnerable community that cannot have much pushback and use them politically. And it's been, unfortunately, very effective.
So let's move on to the next aspect of it. Mental colonization. You mentioned a couple of thinkers or historians who've worked on this, and they explored how empire lived and lives in the mind, shaping desires, self-image, and what is seen to be civilized or polished. Like even today in India, there are certain activities or certain things that you do that classify you as a sophisticated, upper-class, rich person, but they're inherently very British. Drinking chai in India, very common. People drink chai on the side of the road. But when you have high tea, is suddenly when it gets really fancy. Still the same thing, but it's all in the mind. So how would we look at those activities today and look at what these thinkers have to say about it, and then maybe be aware of or adapt?
Yeah, so Thiongo Ngugi, who we talked about already a little bit, would make the argument of trying to actually rid the society of that practice and use, and by practice, I mean using consumption of a given good as a metric to status. So that's part of the colonial, that's the relationship, right?
Yeah.
So the chai is the chai, but if you change the context in which it's being drunk, then suddenly you can start making class and status assumptions and associations, right? And so I think that's, that would be the target, is that try to get rid of that relationship, which would be difficult, right? Which would be difficult and would take probably decades, if not centuries, right?
Oh, yeah.
But that would be the sort of the long game. Fanon would make an argument really about going, what he says, going to the people, right? Going to the masses and not thinking about what he calls colonized intellectuals, of which he is one, but that he believes that the colonized intellectual is a little bit too indebted and therefore sympathetic to the presuppositions of the colonial ruler, that they don't even sort of challenge them, that this wouldn't even, question like that wouldn't even come up for them, right? It wouldn't even be on their radar. But if you go to the Chaival, right, and speak with them and about their everyday life and the sort of consumptive activities of the laborers that come and so on, you could then say, well, this is actually something that's popular in the French sense. It's coming from the masses, or it's coming from the people, right? And if that's then the case, sure, the British might have made tea and opium plantations and done all these terrible things and so on, but it's been integrated into the everyday life, and it's a pause from labor. It's a way to talk to your friends. It's a way to be with family. All of those things. It makes certain types of social life possible, right? And if that's then the case, there's not a problem with it.
Yes.
But they would both agree that making distinctions based on consumptive habits to then put human beings in a hierarchy, that's fundamentally what's colonial about it.
Interesting. Yeah, they've always had a policy of, divide and rule. And that's how you do that.
And look, we can just talk about the Indian case. They found it a little bit easier precisely because of the caste system.
Yes.
Right? So that they further weaponized the caste system, let me put it that way. It's a myth that the British, they didn't invent it, but that they fully mobilized it where it hadn't been,
it was there, they just made
history,
it worse.
It's been there. Sometimes it's been fairly neutral, and sometimes it's been really malevolent. In the British case, again, it's a sort of fundamental mystery. They saw the caste system and they saw, we have a class system.
Yeah.
We understand that, right? And therefore we can make these distinctions.
And what about the Africans in France?
Yeah, so there, there's the interesting thing there is that many of the North Africans who end up in France, especially the first generation, even though, they eventually learn French and so on, but they make efforts to try to assimilate to a certain degree.
Okay.
And, they wear French clothing, and they speak French in the home. They want their children to speak French, et cetera, et cetera. And they're still rejected by the official policies of the French state, right? So it's not even just a sort of de facto rejection by the society, but there's explicit policy by the French state that hopes to further segregate them. And so the response has been interesting because generations later, you've got a sort of turn to Islam and a turn to, learning Arabic and things like that, things that hadn't been taught in the home, precisely because of the produced social isolation of these communities, right? So whereas there was a kind of a window where, let's call it, a more benevolent or benign kind of integration was possible, this happened during colonialism. So these groups were still thought of as fundamentally other and need to be reminded as such in the metropole. So hence they had a separate police for them. There was obvious neighborhoods where they weren't welcome and where they should be. There were buildings that were built for them that were then concierged by former French paratroopers who had done their work in Indochina and Algeria during the wars and so on, and who were thought to know the natives the best and so on. So there was a sort of very concerted effort to mark the line of difference between these peoples while keeping the line of French Republican universalism, which doesn't quite work.
Yeah, I was just thinking, for all we've studied about Germany and Nazis, the French fought it, but it sounds very similar to the Gestapo's and exactly what they fought against.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So Fanon's teacher, Aimé Césaire, also from Martinique, great poet of the 20th century, and then becomes a politician in Martinique itself. He made this argument in a short pamphlet called The Discourse on Colonialism. And he basically said that Nazism, Hitlerism, was so objectionable and people were so repulsed by it is because they were doing colonialism in Europe against white people rather than in Asia, South America, and Africa, where it was seen as perfectly permissible to do such things. Because when you look at most forms of colonialism, it's basically racist authoritarianism.
Pretty much.
That there's different sets of rules. There's a definition of difference in order to rule people differently, right? So, yeah, the French did it a lot, and they did it for a long time. And then, of course, we do have to remember that there were a number of French that were all too willing to collaborate with the Nazis, as there were with a number of other countries in Europe, which tells us something.
Including one of the former British monarchs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. Of course. And, you know, significant portions of the British aristocracy in general, various lords and so on. But if you can go all around Europe, this is one thing to just remember about empire is that all empires require local collaborators for them to actually operate. Unfortunately, the Nazis found many willing collaborators.
Yeah.
And the argument, Césaire's argument, is that they were prepped for that precisely because of the history of European imperialism.
That's one to think about.
So the French, they famously say that the race stuff is all Anglo-American. We don't do race, right? We maybe have a history of religion and religious persecution and stuff like that, but that's precisely why we have laïcité and secularism in our laws, that we've sort of mastered the church and all that. But when you actually look at the colonial record, there's race laws all over that colonial record. In some cases, it's very explicit. The Black Code is very explicit. In other cases, it's more muted, where they're talking about French Muslims of Algeria, right? Which is a category of citizenship. But it's not just French. There's all these other add-ons, right? So they're French, but not quite. They're French with an asterisk. And what that ends up meaning is that they're treated differently by society and the state.
That's unfortunate. A while back, you mentioned how acts of what could be perceived as colonial influence are now becoming popular. So looking at, let's say, Senegal and hip-hop, or Bollywood in India, or there's a specific type of literature in the Caribbean, I can't remember the name of it. Do these still carry the colonial ghosts with them, or is this a sort of individual step out saying, this is inherently Indian, or this is inherently Caribbean, or we're breaking out of colonialism?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about, what type of Bollywood film.
Yeah.
Right? So in one, Lagan, right? There's these anti-colonial, messages built into some of these films, right? So, but in the end, this is for a commercial enterprise, and it's really about making money.
And you mentioned that because I'm in an Indian cinema class this semester, and one of the perspectives we looked at was, this isn't anti-colonial, it's pro-Indian. What? And it's basically about looking at the unity of everybody, and it's not talking about the British, but inherently they are doing that.
Yeah, so look, one thing to think about is that the British Empire produced modern India.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that in much the same way that the world was brought together in a very unfair and unfortunate way, but it was brought together by colonialism, in the same way India was brought together by British colonialism through newspapers, railroads, and things like that, these sort of far reaches of India where the lingua franca ended up being English because the Tamilians don't speak Hindi and vice versa and so on, right? So that the idea of India as one thing is actually almost, as far as we know, has to go through colonialism for that to even be an idea, right? So even the call for Indian unity will forever rely upon that history.
Colonialism,
right? So
We had so many Maharajas and districts, and it was never united.
Yeah, and even during British rule, there was still a lot of technicalities of sort of principalities and stuff like that
Yes.
that were, notionally independent. But even post 1757 to 1857, that period there was a period of, consolidation of power that was still highly fragmented. So, any call for the total unity of India is fundamentally a colonial idea, because it's talking about it's a dialectical response to colonialism. Anti-colonial nationalism is a response to that. Had there not been British colonialism or colonialism at all, we might be talking about many different countries in this vast land.
Yeah, that is something we have to give to them. They did whip it together well at whatever horrible cost.
Far too high a cost, right?
Yeah.
And it's not even like this is a net positive or whatever. It's a brute fact, right? It's an inescapable fact that you have to recognize. And so, one way is about thinking about, I don't know, decolonization for me it's a tough word. I like to think more of like going beyond colonialism, right? Because full decolonization, well, where do we end there, right? Because the Mughals came and colonized as well. I mean, we can just layer upon layer. There's sort of a vast amount of, especially in a place like India, a vast amount of political sedimentation.
It's just
different people who are we going back to Alexander? Like how far are we going here, right?
So, and there were Indian empires that had as well. You had the Mauryan Empire, you had Ashoka, you had the Gupta Empire. I mean, it just goes on.
Sure.
And you're right about the sedimentation. It's suddenly the Mughals have become a part of Indian history. Yes, there are certain political parties that would like to rid that and have more, again, nationalist context in history. So that's another way of supposedly decolonizing it. But it's more accepted that the Mughal Empire is now Indian history. And then you have colonial history, which is the British, which, funnily enough, is not taught in any of the British curricula. I did the IGCSE myself. They don't mention it. So interesting that they have left out a huge part of British history. They don't teach in A levels, they don't teach in the O levels, nor in the IG.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm talking about, is that the colonial fact has yet to be fully confronted.
Yeah.
Right? So if you haven't confronted that, and if there hasn't been a wide-ranging conversation with many participants and many perspectives, what exactly are we decolonizing?
Yeah.
Right. I think that's, it becomes, well, whatever the person who's shouting the word says it is.
Or whoever has the loudest voice.
Yeah.
And on a very superficial level, we're decolonizing, but it's more about tokenism and the danger of that, right? Like, okay, we replaced a statue, we put up an Indian leader over there, or we changed the name of a road from Pedder Road to some long name, which I have no idea what it is. Or we changed the name of the train stations. And okay, great, you're doing that, but it's still at a very superficial level. And like we spoke about earlier, it's more about the symbolic, less about the structural efforts on I would even say a global decolonization movement, right? Because there are so many countries of the Commonwealth that you can't get rid of. You can't get rid of the fact that it happened, but you can, like, again, we spoke about revamp it, integrate it into your own society, or make it your own and move on. But it's still at a very superficial level. We haven't begun to fully understand the depths of colonization and what a decolonized future would look like.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the question of tokenism, again, to a certain extent, there has to be some of that, because you need the pioneering people who are in these positions and so on, who've been systematically shut out, right? So those are achievements. I don't want to say that those mean nothing, right? But if it remains at that, they remain just symbolic achievements. And as time passes, they can then be mobilized to perpetuate the status quo. And if you think the status quo needs amending, that's a dangerous thing to alight upon, because then you just have this sort of plausible deniability. But look, we had a black president, so racism's over. That sort of thing, right? So you can make such pronouncements, and people do. I mean, and it ends up being quite effective. So my kind of mantra here is that the reckoning with the past. I'm going to mess up the line, but there's a line from James Baldwin. It goes something like this: not all things that are faced can be kind of transcended, but you can't transcend anything until you face it, right? So that hasn't happened,
Yeah.
right? That has not happened. And if anything, there's been the reverse, which has been the prettification of the colonial adventure, if you like, as something that is positive, that the British and the French and the Dutch and so on should be proud of, and they've been made to feel bad about it. But actually, there were these sort of humanitarian aspects to it, right? I think that's the wrong direction to go. Unfortunately, that seems to be the direction most societies are going in.
Even if you're talking about like reparations and stuff, I saw this really ridiculous thing that there's this British reporter who's saying, if a country can afford to put their flag on the moon, we shouldn't be giving them loans and helping them out with finances and stuff. The trillions of dollars worth of stuff that has been taken away, one, I don't think they can afford to give the money back as such. Like, they can't afford to just pick up a bunch of $1 trillion and just give it back to India. Two, I think maybe just too corrupt in India now to do that. What'll they do with the money?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's, in the question of reparations is, it's a very dangerous one for the former colonial masters, right? Because especially at the national level, right? So different sort of regions and municipalities have done this across the former metropolitan world, let's call it that. But it's never been adopted by the national state, because that is a precedent that once that precedent comes, there's going to be a lot of people knocking on the doors, right? And to a certain extent, I understand why they would be reticent to do this, for their own finances, for the political blowback that would come in
national pride.
In this sort of, the amount of people balking at this in the domestic politics would be huge. The flip side is, of course, that, if you go to law school, one of the first classes you take is something called torts, right? Which is just the French for wrongs, right? And, so when you've been wronged, you take somebody to court, and usually, it's civil compensation, right? You get the civil compensation. Well, we have records for a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, there's a lot of torts that happened, and it's pretty easy. So when people say, well, how would we distribute it? It was like, well, we have a process for that actually pre-existing in our court system to adjudicate that. And this would just be a matter of scaling and mobilizing researchers who are specialists in certain regions, stuff like that, to do the tabulations of, measuring labor extracted or resource extraction, whatever it may be. It could all be done. It's just a matter of political will, right? So I think I always just say that reparations have happened already. It's just that the slave owners got the reparations for their loss of property, right?
Yeah.
So that the British Crown made the slave owners whole after, in the 1830s, they banned slavery. And it was half the Crown's wealth for 1 year that they handed over to former slave owners. Haiti, who famously had not only a democratic revolution, an anti-colonial revolution, an anti-slavery revolution, but also an anti-racist revolution. They were rewarded for that with basically an indemnity to pay until 1944 to the French for effectively loss of property by their slave colony, right? So whenever you're wondering why Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, it was meant to be by such policies. There's a clear logic there, right? So those reparations have happened, right? That reparations from colonialism and slavery have happened, just not in the direction you think they might have gone.
Yeah. And of late, there's been talk of the British museums and them lending out or having like a timeshare sort of thing where they'll be like, okay, the Kohinoor spends 6 months in India, 6 months here, or even with the Greek statues, they tried that for a while. So there are some efforts being taken to kind of give back, but not really give back in the form that they can give back things that were taken or acknowledge at least on the side of the government. Fun fact: the British government has never apologized for Jallianwala Bagh. They've just expressed their sympathies or their empathy toward the situation. But so I think you can start with an apology. I think that would be a great way to look at that. Um, but let's shift direction a little bit here. So something, and I hope I'm not outing you on this, your students may not know, is that you are also a DJ.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure.
And that you're into various kinds of music, especially vinyl. And looking at your experience as a historian and now along with music, let's look at music and the arts as a sort of voice either for or against colonialism, and how the arts can play a role in a potentially decolonized future. Now, I've heard of instances of freedom songs in Algeria being sung or underground techno at protest movements. From your knowledge of both these fields, where would you say the arts have, what role do the arts have to play in decolonizing?
Yeah, I mean, they have a massive role, right? Because this is precisely why the colonists, modern colonialism, focused on the indigenous cultures to try to either suppress them, segregate them, certainly make them appear as second tier, because they understood that cultural identification, cultural pride does not make a docile subject, right? Um, I think culture is supremely important, and it can have an effect, I think, in movements for anti-colonialism, in movements of decolonization, as such as we're talking about it, right? So, we're after colonialism, but the colonial mentalities and practices are still there. So how do we rid ourselves of those? I think that's a different thing. So with anti-colonialism, there's a very sort of clear distinction between friends and enemies, right? So that we know that this is the enemy, and it's reflected in the lyrics and stuff like that of the songs that come out. With decolonization, what that would look like, would that then mean the French rapper does not rap in French, but they rap in, say, Arabic? But they are living in France, but they're rapping in Arabic, and they've just shrunk their audience. And so who's listening, right? So this is fundamentally the question that anti-colonial writers were dealing with in the 40s and 50s, which is that, do I want to have the largest platform possible in order to get my ideas out? And that usually means acknowledging the fact that the native languages of my region have been crushed, and what's left is English or French or something like that. Some people opted for that, right? So Chinua Achebe, the Things Fall Apart, he had a big debate with Thiongo about this, because Thiongo was basically saying, no, we have to step away. Achebe is saying, no, there's not, the other aspect of colonialism is the miseducation of our people, and therefore our native languages weren't taught, and the schooling was not a focus, and therefore I want to be able to speak not only to those who are in power in my country, but then the global stage. And therefore, global English is the language that has to be embraced. That's a strategic decision. I don't think there's a right or wrong take. I mean, there's good moral and political arguments on both sides of that, which I find attractive. But I think, let's say music is tricky, because if it's not an obvious colonial master, right? You're basically trying to tell your listener First of all, you have to believe me that there is this colonial shadow being cast on our society. And that my song has lyrics attacking it. And by the way, my song's really catchy, right? And you like it, right? And so often with especially music these days, the last part comes first because musicians are just struggling. And so the commodification part becomes quite important. And if it doesn't, the audience is very small. So this is, one of those sort of tensions of art and commerce that I think could end up defanging, let's call it decolonizing music, right? Or one that self-styles itself that way. It's possible, but I don't know. From from history, I think, there's also a lot of projection from the present that, oh, well, we look back at, say, like the 60s and, what is the music that they were listening to then? It's like The Doors and Creedence Clearwater Revival with some anti-war songs and stuff like that. Right. Okay, sure, fine. But that was just a tiny element of what people were listening to then.
Yeah.
And so the idea that this was the soundtrack of the revolution, I think might be a little bit misguided and might be us wishing it was that way, where it was not necessarily that way. There's a whole literature from really the 10s onward, 1910s through the 1970s, which I would just describe as sort of anti-colonial literature, which, it's become canonical in various ways, but also in the worst ways that people refer to it, but they don't read it. So I think everybody from Gandhi to Césaire to Fanon, to Amilcar Cabral, there's a number of people who should be read deeply, slowly, and carefully, because they actually have a lot to say about right now, even though they've been writing about a century ago at this point.
If you had to take something away from this episode, what would it be?
So I guess one big thing is that before you can have something like decolonization, we have to look at colonialism in the face and fully understand it in order to properly decolonize, should that ever happen.
And it's definitely more than just barbaric acts of breaking statues and defacing monuments and burning books and tearing up pieces of art. It goes on to a much deeper level, I would say. It's something that we can't necessarily break away from. Sometimes you have to adapt. Some things we can get rid of, but some things I think you just have to adapt and move on because it happened.
Yeah. I mean, I think the major point here is that the purpose to study this stuff is to think about the social relationships and norms that it produced, that we often unconsciously reproduce. And then to think about that is like, do we want to reproduce it? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but we can only have a thoughtful understanding of it once we've done the proper analysis of what thing colonialism actually was.
Yeah. And just to be aware that activities in our day-to-day life that may not seem to be influenced by colonialism, it's just something that we're doing, might have colonial roots. So think about that, be aware about that. And that's some homework for you guys, all our listeners, to do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. That was fun.
This was a very interesting conversation. And that brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you so much for monkeying around with us. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Monkey Mind Lab.